Good evening, everyone, and thank you to our presentation of Demystifying Medical Aid in Dying, Family Voices. This is part one of a two-part series, and we can talk more at the end about part two, which will be Demystifying Medical Aid in Dying, the Facts. That will be next Monday at the same time. Before we begin, I'd just like to provide a few housekeeping items. Please know that this event will be recorded. Recording is in progress. If you have a question or you communicate at all throughout the meeting, no worries there. That part of the event is not recorded. To ask a question, there is a chat box at the bottom of your screen. We will have a question and answer session at the end. However, if you would like to ask a question before then, feel free to type it in the box and we'll be keeping track of those to answer. You can also send a question anonymously if you choose. Just check the box, send anonymously, and we won't know who it came from. We also like to take a moment to pause and say thank you to all of those who are working on the front lines, especially to our lawmakers during this challenging time in our country. We understand that there's a variety of things happening between a pandemic and social injustice, and so we just would like to recognize that, say thank you to all who are serving us, and hold a space for that. Today, you'll hear from Devin Moss, Dan Diaz, and Myra Schulman, and we'll get into who those folks are as we continue a little bit later. But first, what is medical aid in dying? Medical aid in dying is a medical practice that provides an eligible, terminally ill, mentally capable adult with a prognosis of 6 months or less left to live with the option for medication they can decide to self-ingest to peacefully end their lives. We'll be hearing from Dan and Myra about what that really looks like in just a moment. Currently, there are 10 jurisdictions where medical aid in dying is authorized. 6 of those have happened in the last 5 years. And now 1 in 5 adults live in a state where medical aid in dying is authorized. You can see those states listed here, but they include Oregon, Washington, Montana, Vermont, California, Colorado, DC, New Jersey, and Maine. 20 states in 2020 are considering legislation that would authorize medical aid in dying. And you can see all across the state, the light blue indicates where the law is authorized, and the dark blue states can show you where medical aid in dying is being considered. Before I turn it over to Dan, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Devin. He is going to be your host this evening. Devin is the producer and host of the podcast, The Adventures of Memento Mori, and he is currently in seminary school studying to become a secular humanist chaplain. Devin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for the introduction and the important context around medical aid in dying. I would like to thank Reimagine for hosting us and providing the platform for this conversation, as well as Keeper, Compassion and Choices, Death Doula LA for the collaboration of both 1 and part 2 of Demystifying Medical Aid in Dying. Like Amanda said, my name is Devin, aka DS Moss, and I host The Adventures of Memento Mori, a podcast that explores what I like to call the cosmos of mortality. And it is my profound pleasure to welcome to this conversation Dan Diaz and Myra Schulman about family voices in demystifying medical aid in dying. Welcome, Dan and Myra.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I got to say, so to be clear, I am not an expert in this topic. I am really just a curious student. And so next week in the part 2 of Demystifying Medical Aid in Dying, the Facts, those are where you'll find your panel of experts. That's going to talk more about the legislations and advocacy, although we will touch on those tonight. But what we want to focus tonight on is a conversation about the perspectives of two families that have navigated through this experience and are willing to share their stories. So please, everybody write down your questions because at the end, we'll leave about 15 minutes to answer some questions from the audience. But in the meantime, we are going to just take this conversation where it goes and get some insights. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So Dan, would you mind starting us off with an introduction of your story?
Sure. So my wife, Brittany Menard, her case received a lot of media attention back in 2014. We had to leave, we had to move away from our home in California to Portland, Oregon, so that Brittany would have the option of being able to utilize medical aid in dying, so that she would not have to suffer the dying process that brain tumor had in store for her. To back up a little and give some context, Brittany and I, we met in 2007. We dated for a few years. We lived together down in San Clemente, California. In 2012, we bought a home together, and we got married September of that year, 2012. You can go to the next slide. A few weeks after we got married, Brittany started suffering, having these headaches. They subsided for a while, but by the beginning of 2013, those headaches were back and they were pretty intense. They'd wake her up in the middle of the night. She'd start throwing up, be unable to go back to sleep. A specialist gave her prescription for migraines. They didn't do a scan or anything at that time. And oddly, that seemed to help for a while. But by the end of that year, Brittany, the headaches were back and things were just getting worse. So it was actually on New Year's Day of 2014 that I took Brittany to the emergency room because the headaches were particularly bad that day. We had just come back from lunch. She was throwing up, and that was the first time that they did a CT scan. Shortly thereafter, we discovered that Brittany had a tumor, that it was very large, and that there was no cure. If you go to the next slide, I think that's there. So that is what Brittany is facing. She endured an 8-hour brain surgery at UCSF Medical Center simply to debulk. Essentially, it's to remove the tumor material that they could safely get to in order for the current symptoms to subside, the nausea, the vomiting, the constant pressure at the base of her skull. And at that point, they said that she had 3 to 5 years to live. Unfortunately, just a couple months after that surgery, the MRI showed that the tumor was growing aggressively, indicative of a glioblastoma multiforme. And they then told Brittany that 6 months was all the time that she had left. With that news, Brittany decided that she wanted to have a little bit of control of how her dying process might go. So California did not have medical aid dying available, so we moved to Oregon. She found a house for us to rent on Craigslist. She established residency. She had to find a new medical team. And we were living in Portland, Oregon, and we were researching every clinical trial that offered any glimmer of hope. But at the same time, Brittany then applied for, qualified for, and received the prescription for medical aid in dying. Towards the end of that year, this is now in October of 2014, there she is on the cover of People magazine because her story caught the attention of the country, I guess, and the media labeled her the face of this movement. To be clear, that was not her intent. Brittany was simply wanting to bring attention to this so that legislators would pass laws, specifically in California, but in all states, so that nobody would ever have to go through what we did of leaving home after being told that you have 6 months to live. So during that last month of her life, Brittany, to the extent that she had the energy, she advocated for this. She made a video, she made 3 videos actually, but the initial one got the attention. Compassionate Choices hosted that on their website. And then that's when all the media attention came about. And it was on November 1st of 2014 that the symptoms that Brittany was suffering from, at this point, it's the seizures that are becoming increasingly frequent and severe, that pain that I alluded to at the base of her skull that just would not go away, sleepless nights, the nausea, the vomiting, all of that. It was clear, Brittany would say, that, you know, I'm dying and this tumor is ending my life. So it was on November 1st when Brittany decided that she'd prefer to pass away gently, utilizing medical aid in dying instead of allowing that tumor to continue essentially to torture her to death. So on November 1st, within 5 minutes of taking the sequelbarbital was the medication, Brittany fell asleep very peacefully. And within 30 minutes, her breathing slowed to the point where she passed away. I made a promise to her to help pass this legislation in more states. And so, as the slide previously highlighted, when Brittany died, there were only 4 states that offered this option, and now we're up to 10. So her story and our collective efforts has certainly made a difference in getting this legislation passed in more states. So there's, in a nutshell, that's Brittany's story.
Thanks for sharing that, Dan. I think it's interesting that you just, you pointed out the cluster of the states that have passed medical aid in dying in the most recent years because of the efforts of yours and others. And that's an interesting and a hopeful indication that to see a cluster so tight on that graph. And I think where Myra's story plays into that is that your efforts actually helped to pass the California legislation that I think leads into Myra's story. So Myra, could you take it away?
Yes. So this is a story about my mother, Beverly. She lived in the Los Angeles area, and Mom was this energetic person whose life was really all about service. She was an elementary school teacher in an inner city school in Los Angeles. She taught till she was 75, and the minute she retired, she became a volunteer at the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History and led school group tours there. Outside of that, she tutored adults and tutored children in reading and math and science. So she really cared about people and did a lot of work with that. But she also had all this energy. She went to theaters and movies and walked everywhere, went in Trader Joe's, walked to Trader Joe's to get her groceries. And into her 80s, she had that level of energy. And we would call her the Energizer Bunny because she was just so unstoppable. But over the years, she expressed her views about death and that people, in fact, should have the choice for being able to get medical aid in dying. She was a member of the Hemlock Society way back when, and she was a member of Compassionate Choices. And this is where her life and my life really intersected with Dan and Brittany. When the story about Brittany got into the news, it really sparked a conversation that I had with my mom, an opening really to ask her, hey mom, if you get to the point in your life where you're terminally ill, would you want me to help you move to Oregon so that you could have medical aid in dying? And she was like, absolutely yes. And then, because of Brittany's openness and Dan's continuing fight, California passed its End of Life Options Act, as it's called, its medical aid in dying law. And my mother was incredibly relieved. It was like, okay, I don't have to worry about this anymore. And anyway, eventually, 4 years ago, she started taking naps, which completely freaked me out because my mother never took naps. And eventually she was diagnosed with colon cancer, which by the time it was discovered had already metastasized to her liver, which is incurable. So she was terminally ill when she was diagnosed. And as I accompanied her to doctor visits, they would say, so you can either have surgery to remove the tumor in your colon, die a better death from liver failure, or you can have a horrible death dying from a blocked colon. And my mother looked at the doctor and she said, well, these days we have a third option. I can request a prescription which would allow me to end my own life and not do either of those other things. And the law in California had passed a year earlier, but it had just been implemented a couple of months before my mother received her diagnosis. So these conversations with the doctors went on, every single one of them. It was kind of like it was news to them, actually, that a patient was thinking about this. My mother did decide to have the surgery to remove the colon tumor, though she was very ambivalent about it. And it took her a long time to recover, but she had a few months where she had a lot more energy, etc. But then the fatigue and tiredness came back, the liver tumors were growing, and the doctors decided that she had less than 6 months to live and gave her that diagnosis at that point. So perhaps we can discuss in more detail later the process of going through this, but she did obtain the prescription from the palliative care doctor as the prescribing physician. The surgeon, the surgical oncologist, agreed to be the consulting physician, and my mother received the prescription. And this whole process was accompanied by really kind of conversations that, at least on my side and my sister's side, and my sister's in the picture there, where it's hard to talk about dying in this society with people. But obviously, and my mom was far more comfortable with it than my sister and I were. Anyways, eventually she said, okay, if I can't walk to Trader Joe's, my quality of life is too low. Well, she got to a point she couldn't walk to Trader Joe's. And she said, okay, if I can't walk around the block, my quality of life is too low. And then she couldn't actually walk out her front door. And that was the final decision point for her, because she was so weak and so fatigued, and the pain in her abdomen was growing and growing. And she knew she was going to need to have in-home help. She would get weaker and weaker and need, personal, intimate care that she did not want. She was very private, very reserved. That was not the way she wanted her life to go. And she had no choice about death. Death was there. So she decided it was time. And my sister had pulled out all the t-shirts my mother had from the Natural History Museum that had dinosaurs and butterflies and everything. Everyone, my sister and her husband and my husband and I and my mother, all put on one of these shirts on my mother's last morning. We took pictures together. And then she got in her own bed, in her own house. Thank you, Dan. she could do it in her own house. And she drank the mixture with my sister and I holding her. And within just a few minutes, she was unconscious. And it took 5 hours actually for her to finally pass away. But we were there the whole time, cuddling her, singing to her, telling stories from our childhood. It was really a gentle, beautiful way to go that I, now living in New York, am fighting hard to make available to people in my state.
Thank you for that beautiful story. It's touching, and hopefully in New York and other states we can get it too. I think it's important, and I'm going to ask both of you to help me level set for what it means by helping me identify what it does not mean. So medical aid in dying is not active euthanasia. Medical aid in dying is not physician-assisted suicide. So Dan, can you help articulate the difference between medical aid in dying and physician-assisted suicide and active euthanasia?
Sure. So the terminology that I use is medical aid in dying because that is accurate. It was indeed that medication that aided Brittany in her dying process. Euthanasia is a term that gets thrown around a lot. It has nothing to do with this. Euthanasia would be where a third party is administering something to an individual. And even that the term physician-assisted suicide, the opponents like using that term, that conjures the notion that there's a physician doing something to the patient. And that also is not the way this plays out. In our case, the medication was sequelbarbital. There were 100 capsules. We had to open those 100 capsules, empty the powder into a glass. It took like 40 minutes to do that. That powder is then mixed with 4 or 5 ounces of water, and the strongest safeguard is that the terminally ill individual has to be able to consume that medication on her own. So nothing is being done to the patient. So just to distinguish between that. Now, as far as the terminology, and I'll cover this slide pretty quickly, the opponents, they do like using that term suicide because their whole campaign seems to be focused around scaring people. Their campaign is based on fear. That term suicide is a very loaded term. Words not only have meaning, but they also possess temperature and color. And that term suicide is thrown around very irresponsibly by the opponents. But just to be clear, before I go through this slide, I want to state that because now, having worked on this legislation, I run into all kinds of people at the state capitals that I've been to. And on quite a few occasions, I've run into individuals who are there trying to pass legislation to get more funding because their loved ones did actually die by suicide. So I want to make a distinction before going through this, that we need to, as a society, do a much better job and stop the stigmatizing and the shame that we seem to place upon either the individuals or family members of individuals who have died by suicide. These are individuals who we as a society need to do a better job of caring for them, listening, being aware of those signs, because these are people who could otherwise, and so now I'll start going through this slide. In the case of medical aid dying, and I'll use Brittany as the example, this person is terminally ill. So the decision to continue living is no longer there, whereas in the case of an individual who is despondent, depressed, and they're contemplating suicide, that person may not at all be terminally ill. In the case of medical aid dying, the person is mentally capable. That is one of the criteria in order to be granted the prescription, versus in the case of somebody who is contemplating suicide, most people would say, well, that person is mentally impaired. They're looking to harm themselves where they are otherwise potentially healthy. In the case of medical aid in dying, that person wants to live. Brittany certainly wanted to live. In the case of a suicide, that person wants to or thinks that they want to die. In the case of medical aid in dying, the ending is planned. Brittany had 7 people in the room. I was there, her parents, 3 of her friends, my younger brother. In the case of a suicide, that end is often very impulsive, many times with a firearm. In the first case, medical aid in dying, the death is gentle, as has been described by both Myra and by me. In the case of a suicide, that death is often violent. The person is connected to loved ones. As I mentioned, there were 7 people in that room with Brittany. In the case of a suicide, that person acts alone, because if they do inform anyone, then they're beforehand of what their intentions might be, those individuals might be investigated or potentially prosecuted. And so that puts their family in legal peril. And then lastly, this is, I alluded to at the beginning, there's a normal grieving process. Brittany took control and was able to have a gentle dying process, and it allowed us all to prepare for that. In the case of a suicide, because of just such a shock to the family, to the friends, to the loved ones, that there is then that sense of grief and shame and everything, which there should not be. But unfortunately, that is the reality. So just to kind of share this so that the audience can understand what medical aid in dying provides. It's much more than just that medication. More than 1/3 of the people who qualify for the medication, they never end up utilizing it. They die of their underlying disease without having to take the medication. But having that medication does provide a lot of relief, just knowing that they've taken back just that little bit of control from that disease. So thanks for letting me to clarify and share that.
Yeah, and you touched on something too that I find interesting about this idea of taking control, and at least facing it on your terms. And I think so often we are told to fight, right? Particularly cancer, we fight cancer, but it sounds like you're describing too that you're not giving up hope necessarily, and you're not giving up the fight, because you said if 1/3 of the people still die by the underlying disease, that just demonstrates another power. And did Brittany experience this other transformative or I guess what I'm getting to, was she afraid? Did fear override?
No, and that's the thing. That's the benefit of having had this option and having qualified for it. As soon as Brittany received the green light and we picked up that medication, the fear that she had previously, she was terrified of how that brain tumor might end her life. Pain that not even morphine can alleviate. She was Dilaudid is 4 times stronger than morphine, and she was on some hefty doses of Dilaudid. The seizures that I mentioned keep getting worse. As a tumor grows and puts pressure on different parts of the brain, she loses her eyesight, so now she's blind. Partial paralysis is likely, complete paralysis a possibility. That terrified her. But as soon as she received the medication, that fear vanished, because Brittany all of a sudden by having the medication, she had something that the tumor could not defeat. So really what it did was, what you mentioned, kind of this transformative, or what she experiences, it actually emboldened her to live longer and fight harder, because she no longer had to be so terrified of how her final few days on this green earth might play out. In a sense, she had already counted for that by going through the process of moving to Oregon and qualifying for the medication. She now knew that she could, and that term is elusive, control. We as human beings, it's just our nature. We want to control everything. Well, Death certainly is one thing that you can't control. It comes for all of us. The method of that dying process, though, that was something that this program afforded her just a little bit of control over. And for her, that was huge. So yes, it provided that ability for her to, it emboldened her to live as long as she possibly could, knowing that she had secured the medication to have some say as to how things play out.
Were there any, at the beginning, were there any considerations that made her potentially, and Myra, I'm going to extend this to you as well, that that made Brittany potentially not consider this option?
No, because, and I'm glad you asked that, because recognize the only thing that she is pursuing is to have the option. Whether she ends up having to take it or not, that's what's driving that decision, is the symptoms that she's feeling and the progression of that tumor, which we can see every time we get a new scan. So she has this option, and I've had this question asked a few different ways of me. It's like, oh, well, were there any regrets, or were you supportive of her decision? And it's like, supportive of her decision to have an option, whether she decides to utilize it or not. The answer is real simple. I put myself, or I would ask anybody in the audience, put yourself in her position and then ask yourself, would I at least want to know that I have that option, whether I decide to utilize it or not, that decision, that little bit of control, that I'm the one who has that choice to make. And so it was really that simple, is to say, wait, if the roles were reversed, and if it was me with that tumor that I showed on the screen, if that was in my skull, I would have been telling her the exact same thing. Sweetie, we're going to have to move to Oregon to make sure that I don't have to suffer. Hopefully, I won't have to utilize the medication. Hopefully, the dying process towards the end will be gentle. Unfortunately, in Brittany's case, it was evident day after day, things were only getting worse.
And Myra, did your mother have any considerations or doubt at the onset of this?
I agree with Dan. It's very much adding another option that you have. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. I mean, if she could have decided to just go through with whatever was going to happen in her body. So she was very aware that this was increasing her choices about how her life might end, and effectively there was no downside to it, other than the hassles involved in going through the process to get the prescription. But I think it was unquestioning for her that was something to pursue.
Let's move into the process, and maybe if anybody is listening that their family is faced with this, so we've gotten so far that, so you have to, Myra, you talked about, you have to have two doctors. You have to have the prescribing doctor and the co-prescribing doctor, if I got that correctly. Does it take a long time to actually get the medication?
What was your experience, Dan?
Well, hell, for us, we had to move to Portland in order to even start the process.
Outside of moving states.
Outside of that, so the normal process is that, yes, two physicians have to agree, independent of one another, that the person is terminally ill. They have 6 months or less to live. They make the request both verbally and in writing. In California, in most states, not all, but there's a 15-day waiting period. So that right there that's a part of the legislation. And this comes from physicians in California who are prescribing physicians. It doesn't matter the state, California, Oregon, Washington, Vermont. Every physician that I've had conversations with, they've said that 15-day waiting period, that needs to be modified. That legislation should not contain that 15-day waiting period, because there are individuals who they don't last those 15-day they don't last through the 15-day waiting period. They've otherwise qualified for it. As I mentioned, the strongest safeguard is that the patient has to be able to consume that medication on her own. It's not something that is given to the patient through an IV or anything. So that's the process. It's, finding a physician that will participate. It is completely voluntary. So it's voluntary for the patients, whether they decide this is something they're going to pursue. It's also voluntary, and rightly so, for physicians if they want to participate. The issue I take is when a medical institution, they can determine that they, as a medical facility, so for example, a Catholic affiliated hospital or medical institution, they can opt out, and they can insist that any of the physicians within their group also, they are banned from participating. That I think takes it a little too far. I would hope that physicians that acting, following the protocol and the law, it's legal, that they would be able to take care or care for their patients and not abandon them by saying, oh, you're going to have to find a different doctor if you're interested in medical aid and dying, because the administrators at the hospital that they're at won't allow them to. So, the process, Kaiser here in California does a very good job of it. But, count on it's 15 days. Now it's probably closer to 21, a 3-week process if everything goes smoothly. And I think we need to do a little better than that. It should not take that long.
Myra, anything to add to that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, when my mother was, diagnosed as being terminally ill with cancer, but was not within the 6-month to end of life prognosis, she began to talk about it with each doctor that, she went to see. The first one she talked with was her internist, who had been her doctor for, 15 years or so, and who she really liked. And he was extremely uncomfortable when she brought up the subject with him, and eventually said that, he, tried to address it by saying, make sure you don't die in pain. And that's a very different answer. That's, make sure you have palliative care. And I think palliative care is wonderful, but it's quite a different thing than being given the option to end your life at the time you choose, when it is time to go, when you're terminally ill. And he referred her to palliative care, but it actually took quite a bit of work on my sister's and my part to find a palliative care doctor, strangely enough. And that palliative care doctor did agree to be the prescribing physician. And his story, he had worked through the AIDS crisis and had really seen horrible, horrible deaths. And he really wanted patients to be able to have the option to have a gentle death. And so he was very supportive. And then the oncologist said, I'm a healer. I can't do this. And but the surgeon, the surgical oncologist, when my mother asked her, she was like, well, of course, but you don't need to ask me. There are lots of doctors, you have an internist, right? And she was surprised to hear from my mother that other doctors were actually refusing. And I thought about this particular doctor, Dan, when you were saying, put yourself in that person's situation, have empathy. And when I took that doctor aside and I thanked her for being willing to be the consulting physician, and she just looked at me with surprise, and she's like, I'm just treating your mother the way I would like to be treated. And that, that really spoke to me, that I think it's something that people, once they put themselves in that position, can really understand. So anyway.
And just to be clear, and I know the answer, but a doctor does not need to be at the home when the liquid is consumed.
Correct. Yeah. No. This legislation is one where the person in applying for it, that's when all the boxes are being checked. Is this person mentally competent? They have to be 18 or older, so they have to be an adult. They have to be terminally ill, 6 months or less to live. So, and that's scrutinized by not just the physician, but there's a whole team determining. It's like, and I'll use Brittany's case, although I have countless examples where the determination is yes, in all likelihood, this person will not live longer than 6 months. So we receive that medication. Brittany puts that in the cupboard and she focuses on living life.
Yeah.
To be honest, we had medications that were just as lethal sitting right there on the nightstand. So the fact that now we have a prescription for sequelbarbital, yeah, so what? We had the Dilaudid I mentioned. We had enough there to put Brittany, me, and anybody else to sleep for good. And that was there, and the patient gets that simply because they're in pain. So this process simply affords the appropriate protections so that that patient has that bit of control. And they're the ones calling the shots, and things don't have to be done. Let me just add this. Let's not kid ourselves. This kind of stuff happens behind closed doors all the time in states where medical aid in dying has not been passed.
Yeah.
And it's typically with the administration of morphine, and it's behind closed doors. And I would argue that's where you run the risk of abuses. That's where you run the risk of, is that what the patient wanted, or is that what a family member who is just impatient or upset or distraught, and they're pushing things along and they're pushing. So the passage of this legislation, I would say for the first time, it really protects what the opponents would call the most vulnerable in our society, the elderly, the disabled, etc., because it's only that patient that can make this request and have that conversation with the physician. It can't be done by proxy. It can't be done by power of attorney. So it really protects that terminally ill individual as they navigate end of life. It's punishable as a felony. It's written into the law if anybody tries to coerce or push a person into pursuing getting this prescription for medical aid in dying. So I think the benefits is really that it puts that patient front and center, not a niece or the granddaughter or anybody else. It's the patient. The patient is driving their care.
So with all of that being said, and I can't imagine somebody not wanting a gentle death, what are the arguments for the people that oppose this? Is there a common, I'm assuming there is, but is there a common argument about why someone would oppose this?
Myra, you want to start the answer? Because I certainly, you and I both know the answer. It's the Catholic Church primarily.
Yeah.
So the
That's
Catholic
religion.
It's religion.
Yeah. And as I alluded to before, nationwide support for medical aid in dying is 72%. Nationwide support for medical aid in dying amongst Catholics is 70%. So the support is there. It's just the church. The church leadership is opposed, and that's fine. That's their right. They can be opposed to it. But the people sitting in the pews, the congregation, everybody I still go to the same church that I was baptized in. I'm Catholic. I was an altar boy. I went to Catholic school. The people sitting in the pews, they agree with Brittany that this is up to the terminally ill individual. But yes, the opposition primarily comes from faith-based arguments of, well, this is not what God intended. Yeah, I don't think God, the loving, caring God that I learned of, would require Brittany to have to continue to endure the suffering and for that to only get worse. She goes blind, she becomes paralyzed, and have that be her dying process. So it's a shame that people might think that God somehow requires that. I disagree. I think God would celebrate the fact that, yeah, Brittany, she had a gentle death. That's a good thing.
Myra, do you want anything to add about?
Well, I think, there's very vocal opposition from the church. And I think because, in our country and perhaps many other countries, it's, we deny death and we're extremely uncomfortable talking about it. And so it's not something, I think when people are asked by, poll takers, they say, yes, I think someone should be able to get a prescription to end their life if they're terminally ill, et cetera, et cetera. But to make that view public, to push for it, I think there's a discomfort around death that people have to get over, or they have to face before they can really do that.
Yeah, I think we do culturally have an issue denying death, denying American history. So I think there is a frequency of action that's the current right now. So as someone that is moved or feels like they want to help, in what ways can I or can anybody else help get this legislation through in whatever state that we live in?
Well, I always refer people to compassionatechoices.org, and the map that was shown earlier of where legislation is moving forward. Well, actually, you go to compassionatechoices.org and you can get to that map, click on the state that you live in, and you'll see if legislation has been introduced, the bill numbers, who the legislators, the sponsors are, and right there is where the whole thing starts. Get in touch with your legislator and share your story. Myra has a story, I have a story, but more times than not, a person who is supportive of this, I've found that it's because they have experienced a really bad dying process. A family member, one of their loved ones died in a horrific way, suffered a lot, and so they're very enthusiastic about making change. It's a shame it has to come to that for them to be interested or involved in this. So yes, to those who are on this broadcast right now, is go to compassionatechoices.org, click on get involved, and you can get in touch with the local CNC personnel, as well as find out which legislators need some convincing and reach out to them.
All right, I'm gonna make a call for questions for those listening right now. If you have questions you'd like to ask Dan or Myra, please write them in the chat. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask you both one question. My last, well, I don't know if it's my last one, but maybe my last question is, was there one thing in your process that surprised you the most going through with your family?
So the thing that really surprised me, it really is a process. That's, to begin with, sorry, having trouble getting my thoughts together. So my conversations with my mother about death started when she was about 80 years old, and she died when she was 89. And to be honest, I was curious what she thought about death and whether or not people, should be able to choose their own end when they're, terminally ill, et cetera. And so we had an interesting conversation about that, but, she seemed absolutely immortal to me at that point. I mean, she was, full of energy and tearing around and everything. But what happened over the years is she got, older, and quite noticeably older. And certainly when she became terminally ill, I became less comfortable having these conversations. But she was always very, very open. I mean, she wouldn't necessarily start the conversation, but if I asked her, she would just answer like, I was asking her what she thought about the weather. It was very, very interesting how easy it was for her to talk about it. And I don't know why, though I think certainly as people get older, they get more accepting, or many people get more accepting of death.
For me, so one thing that I can talk to as far as a certain level of surprise, the difference that Brittany and I experienced talking to medical professionals in California versus when we were in Oregon. Because at that point in Oregon, they'd had the law for 16 years. And I believe that because they've had that legislation for so long, having those conversations with them, with the clinicians, doctors, the medical personnel, it was much easier. In California, probably because of her age, Brittany was only 29 years old. And just, her appearance, it's like, wait, this person's way too young to have that size tumor in her skull. There's no way, how could this be? So many of them were surprised by it, kind of recognizing the circumstances that she was in and thinking, wow, just the injustice of this. But it was tough for them. And Brittany was very straightforward, and she would ask the hard questions, and she expected direct answers. She did not do well with anybody sugarcoating or blowing sunshine. That was very quickly, any doctor who attempted that would find a quick rebuke from Brittany. But once we got to Oregon, those conversations were a lot easier. And I think in large part due to the fact that physicians there know that they are not the center of the patient's care. The patient is the center of the patient's care. And they recognize that the patient can, if they qualify for it, they can receive that medication. And so their willingness to talk about just end-of-life care, end-of-life options, death itself, what that looks like, those conversations were much easier once we were in Oregon. So that was one thing that stuck out to me. And now, we've had the law went into effect in California in 2016. So it's been 4 years now. And I would say that within this time, the conversations are getting better and easier here. Not specific about medical aid and dying, just to make this point. The number of individuals who will find themselves in this predicament, or the number of individuals who end up utilizing medical aid and dying, it's a fraction of a percent. In Oregon, the number is 0.3% of all deaths in Oregon are for people who utilize medical aid and dying. In California, we're a population of 40 million states. Every year, there's about 185,000 deaths of all causes. And the number of individuals who utilize medical aid and dying in a given year depends on the year, but it's been anywhere from 300 to about 450. So 300 out of 186,000 or 185,000 deaths, again, it's like 0.1%. So, but the thing is, if you're the individual who's suffering from and enduring, and this gets back to what I mentioned, yeah, knowing that you have that option is going to be very meaningful. And finding physicians who will have that conversation openly, it's no small task. And I'm glad to see that more physicians are recognizing that they can have these conversations. It's not a third rail issue. We are mortal. We do all eventually die. So we should be able to talk about it.
Okay, we have two questions from the audience. This first one is addressed to both of you. So I'm going to point the arrow at Myra to give the first stab at answering it. I'm a Canadian medical assistant in dying research, and we're finding that people face a lot of stigma here. We also offer physician-assisted death, where the drugs are administered by the physician, so physicians are dealing with stigma too. The result is often disenfranchised grief. Have either of you faced opposition in your grief because your loved one chose medical aid in dying?
So, in a way, this gets back to the discussion earlier about suicide and what a loaded term that is. And that when people apply that term or think about it in the way we generally think about suicide, when we're talking about medical aid in dying, I think they do apply that stigma to it. And to me, it's really important to share these experiences with people so that they can understand that, my mother chose medical aid in dying so she could end her life on her own terms before she was in terrible pain and unable to get out of bed, unable to do anything to care for herself. I personally think that that is a very understandable, perhaps admirable choice, and certainly have shared, obviously here I am talking about it, shared her choice with many people, in part because I feel like almost an obligation to do that, to either, if the stigma exists, to help dispel it, or to help avoid it being created. If you try and keep it a secret or whatever, you're acting like you're ashamed of it. And so I have told a lot of people, including at my mother's memorial service, where there were people who had been volunteers in the museum with her, and they had no idea what had happened to her. She seemed great, and the next thing they knew, she had passed away. And so they asked, and so I told them, and they were, probably in their late 70s, early 80s, and there was a husband and wife, and they looked at each other, and I could just see them thinking, oh, this is something I would like to be able to choose to do too, and I didn't know that I could. So they were relieved. But I've heard about this stigma in Canada. I would actually like to hear more about it, and that physicians particularly are being stigmatized for assisting.
Dan,
go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, in the case of Brittany, and this is something that Myra just touched on, that so the question, have either of you faced opposition in your grief because your loved one chose medical aid in dying? In the case of Brittany, because it was so public, overwhelmingly what we received were letters of support. Whether it was email, physical mail, all the articles that were written. Yes, on occasion we would get at the end of a article that was written, if you read the comments, that's where you would find some negative from,
never read the comments.
Refer to the internet trolls that are there, but they're just looking to create whatever controversy they can, and so they would write all kinds of crazy theories about why Brittany Menard, somebody who none of them know, why she's making the decision that she is, et cetera, et cetera. But so the straight answer is that no, I have not faced opposition in my grief because Brittany chose medical aid in dying. By and large, what I receive, countless times, individuals approaching me at a state capitol or at Costco and recognizing, knowing who Brittany was and saying thank you. So that's the overwhelming response that I've gotten. As far as physicians in Canada, so yes, in Canada has a different situation there, where a person applies for the process and they have their safeguards in place, but then the patient gets to choose if they want to self-administer the medication on their own, or if they want to, they can choose to allow the physician to administer the medication. They have to go through the same scrutiny, but in the end, they can say, you know what, that's one less thing. I don't want to have to worry about mixing pills and everything. So yes, I'll just allow the physician to administer the medication at the time of that the patient chooses. Which here in the United States, that would be considered euthanasia. Euthanasia is illegal in all 50 states. So as a society, until we choose that to change those laws, then here in the United States, it's that the patient has to administer the medication on her own. You know, in the future, if we choose, if we decide that no, we're going to change that, then fine. You know, the citizenry of this great nation will decide to change that. But in Canada, they do have that option where they can say, you know what, I've gone through this process, I've qualified for it. The physician can administer it, and you know, they're afforded that same gentle dying process. I don't think there should be any stigma attached to that at all. I guess in Brittany's, quoting Brittany, she would say, nobody can make you feel inferior without your permission. And it's true. If what Myra mentioned, that Brittany was certainly a confident, well-spoken, and determined individual. So she wasn't going to allow somebody else's opinion, whether it's coming from a religious organization or otherwise, somehow make her doubt or second guess what she is doing, which was simply ensuring that she was not going to suffer. And so I guess I would maybe share Brittany's words of wisdom, that you can only feel inferior if you've allowed yourself to feel that way. So, you know, I hope that that stigma does go away and we're able to get past that, or in Canada, they're able to get beyond that.
Well, thank you both. We are at time. I want to acknowledge that there are a few questions here in the queue. KLD, thank you for that question. Chloe and Anonymous. I would encourage everybody to then go to the second part of this, which is the same time next Monday, Demystifying Medical Aid in Dying, the Facts, where one in particular was asking about insurance, insurance costs. So you could certainly find the answers there. Dan, Myra, I want to give you a heartfelt thanks for this conversation. It's been helpful to me and hopefully helpful to many of the people that were listening. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And
Yes.
that is.
Hi. Yes, Dan, Myra, thank you so much. I just wanted to point out quickly, a lot of people were asking where they could learn more. And I know Dan pointed to the Compassion and Choices website, but we actually created a really great resource. If you follow what's on your screen, Compassion and Choices, /reimagining with Compassion and Choices, we made a special website that outlines a lot of the specifics about advocacy and details about what the laws look like just for this presentation. So certainly feel free to take a look at that. And then I also just wanted, again, to mention, if you haven't registered for part 2, Demystifying Medical Aid in Dying, the Facts, we hope to see you next week. It's actually at 7 p.m., the same time, where we'll have Mandy, the creator of My Keeper, Jill, who is a death doula, and the campaign director, Corinne Carey from Compassion and Choices. So hopefully we'll see you then, and thank you all for being here. I hope you have a great evening.